Judge Richard Whitmore pushed open the heavy wooden door of his private office. His black robes flowed behind him like a cape. He was a tall man with gray hair and a face that showed he was used to being in charge. He had been a judge for 15 years and thought he had seen everything. The judge walked down the hallway with confident steps. His expensive leather shoes made sharp sounds on the marble floor. He wore a gold watch that caught the light as he moved. Everything about him said, power and importance. Other people in the hallway stepped aside when they saw him coming. Judge Whitmore was taking a break between cases. His morning had been busy with several hearings. Most of them were simple matters that he could decide quickly. He enjoyed the feeling of being the most important person in the room. When he spoke, everyone listened. When he made a decision, that was final. As he walked through the lobby, Judge Whitmore noticed Marcus sitting on the wooden bench. The young man was still reading his papers very carefully. His old clothes and worn bag caught the judge's attention right away. Judge Whitmore stopped walking and looked at Marcus for a long moment. The judge had seen many people like this before. Poor defendants who couldn't afford good lawyers. People with small problems who thought the court could solve everything. Usually these people were confused and didn't understand how the legal system worked. They often came to the wrong courtroom or brought the wrong paperwork. Judge Whitmore decided to walk over to Marcus. He put on what he thought was a helpful smile. But the smile was not really kind. It was the type of smile adults give to children when they think the children are being silly. "Excuse me, son," Judge Whitmore said as he approached the bench. Marcus looked up from his papers. He could see the judge's robes and knew this was an important person. Marcus had been taught to show respect to judges, so he started to stand. "Up. No need to get up," Judge Whitmore said, waving his hand. "I just wanted to help you out. You look a little lost." "I'm not lost, Your Honor," Marcus replied politely. "But thank you for asking." Judge Whitmore's smile got bigger, but not in a nice way. "Well, son, I think you might be in the wrong place. This is a courthouse, not a social services building. If you need help with food stamps or housing assistance, those offices are downtown." Marcus felt a small spark of anger in his chest, but he kept his face calm. "I understand this is a courthouse, Your Honor. I'm supposed to be here." The judge laughed a little. It was not a happy laugh. "Really? And what exactly brings you here? Parking ticket? Small claims court?" Before Marcus could answer, another judge walked up to them. This was Judge Patricia Mills. She was a woman in her 50s with short brown hair and expensive glasses. She had been friends with Judge Whitmore for many years. They often ate lunch together and complained about their cases. "Richard, what's going on?" Judge Mills asked. "Oh, just trying to help this young man find his way," Judge Whitmore replied. "He seems to think he belongs in our courthouse." Judge Mills looked at Marcus from head to toe. She saw his old sneakers, his too big suit, and his worn bag. She came to the same conclusion as Judge Whitmore. This was clearly someone who was out of place. "How sweet of you to help," she said to Judge Whitmore. Then she looked at Marcus with the same fake, helpful smile. "Honey, are you here for traffic court? That's in the basement. You take the elevator down one floor." "I'm not here for traffic court," Marcus said quietly. Both judges looked at each other and smiled. They thought this was amusing. Here was this young man in cheap clothes trying to act like he belonged in their world of important legal matters. "Well then, what kind of case do you have?" Judge Whitmore asked. His voice had a tone that suggested he thought Marcus was making things up. Marcus could have told them the truth right then. He could have explained who he really was and why he was there. But something inside him decided not to. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was curiosity about how far these judges would take their assumptions. Maybe he wanted to teach them a lesson. "I have business in courtroom 4B, Marcus said simply. Judge Whitmore's eyebrows went up. "Courtroom 4B? That's my courtroom. And I can tell you right now, there's nothing on my schedule today that would involve someone like—" He stopped himself before he said something too rude. "Someone like what?" Marcus asked. His voice was still polite, but there was a strength in it that hadn't been there before. Judge Mills jumped in quickly. "What my colleague means is that we have very complex cases today. Constitutional law, federal procedures, that sort of thing. These cases require lawyers with years of experience and extensive education. I see, Marcus said. He went back to reading his papers as if the conversation was over. This annoyed Judge Whitmore. He was used to people hanging on his every word. He didn't like being dismissed by someone in old clothes. Look, son, I'm trying to save you some embarrassment here, the judge said. His voice was getting less friendly. Whatever you think you're supposed to do in my courtroom, you're probably wrong. Court procedures are very complicated. One mistake and you could make things much worse for yourself. Marcus looked up again. I appreciate your concern, Your Honor, but I'm confident I'm in the right place. Judge Mills laughed out loud this time. Confident? Honey, do you even know what constitutional law is? Marcus could have answered that question in great detail. He could have discussed Supreme Court cases, federal procedures, and constitutional principles for hours. Instead, he just nodded and said, I know enough. Both. Judges found this very funny. They looked at each other and shook their heads like they were watching a child pretend to be a doctor. Well, this should be interesting, Judge Whitmore said to Judge Mills. I haven't seen confidence like this since my nephew decided he could represent himself in traffic court. At least your nephew had looked up the law on the internet, Judge Mills replied. This young man probably doesn't even own a computer. They both laughed again. Marcus could hear the meanness in their laughter. These were people who thought they were better than others because of their positions and their expensive clothes. They had decided who he was without knowing anything about him. Tell you what, son, Judge Whitmore said, still smiling his fake smile. When you realize you're in over your head in there, just raise your hand and ask for a recess. I'll try to help you out. Maybe recommend a public defender who can clean up whatever mess you're about to make. That's very kind of you, Marcus said, but his tone suggested he didn't think it was kind at all. The two judges walked away, still chuckling to themselves. Marcus could hear them talking quietly as they left. Poor kid has no idea what he's walking into, Judge Mills said. Probably watched some legal drama on TV and thinks he knows how court works, Judge Whitmore replied. This is going to be painful to watch. Marcus sat alone on the bench again. The folder of papers was still open in his lap. But now he wasn't really reading them. He was thinking about what had just happened. These judges had looked at him and decided he was ignorant, poor, and out of place. They were right about him being poor, but they were very wrong about everything else. Marcus checked his old watch again. 20 minutes until he needed to be in courtroom 4B. 20 minutes until Judge Whitmore learned that appearances could be very deceiving. 20 minutes until everything changed. Marcus Thompson walked through the big glass doors of the courthouse. His old sneakers made a squeaking sound on the shiny marble floor. The sound echoed through the tall ceiling above him. He looked up at the beautiful building around him. Big. Windows let in bright sunlight. Fancy paintings hung on the walls. Everything looked expensive and important. Marcus carried an old brown bag over his shoulder. The bag was made of leather, but it was very worn out. There were scratches all over it. One of the straps was starting to break. He had bought this bag at a yard sale 3 years ago for $5. It was the only bag he could afford back then. Now he used it to carry all his important papers. His suit was gray and a little too big for him. The pants were too long and bunched up around his ankles. The jacket sleeves covered most of his hands. He had bought this suit at a thrift store for $25. It was the best suit he could find that fit his budget. The previous owner must have been a bigger man. Marcus tried to make it look good by rolling up the sleeves a little. His shirt was white but had been washed so many times that it looked a bit gray. The collar was frayed at the edges. His tie was navy blue with small dots on it. He had learned to tie it by watching videos on the internet. It took him 15 tries to get it right this morning. Marcus stopped in the middle of the lobby and pulled out a piece of paper from his pocket. He unfolded it carefully and read the room number. Again, courtroom 4B. He had checked this number 5 times already, but he wanted to be sure. Being late or going to the wrong place would be terrible. This was too important to mess up. People walked around him in all directions. Lawyers in expensive suits hurried past him. Their shoes were shiny and made confident clicking sounds on the floor. Their briefcases looked new and cost more than Marcus made in a month. Some of them talked on their phones while they walked. Others walked with their assistants who carried extra bags and files. A woman in a black suit walked by. Her heels were so high that Marcus wondered how she could walk in them. Her hair was perfect, and she wore makeup that made her look like she was ready for a magazine photo. She carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than Marcus's rent. She looked at him for a second as she passed. Her eyes moved from his old shoes to his too big suit. Then she looked away quickly and kept walking. Marcus felt a little uncomfortable, but he was used to this. People often looked at him this way. They saw his old clothes and made up their minds about who he was. They thought they knew everything about him just by looking at his appearance. Most of the time, they were very wrong. He found a wooden bench near the wall and sat down. The wood was old and polished smooth by thousands of people who had sat there before him. Marcus opened his worn bag and pulled out a thick folder. The folder was full of legal papers. Some were typed, and some were handwritten. All of them were very important. Marcus opened the folder and began to read. He had read these papers many times before, but he wanted to read them again. Every detail mattered. Every word could be important. He took out a pen and made small notes in the margins. His handwriting was neat and careful. A group of lawyers walked by, talking loudly about their cases. One of them laughed at something another had said. They all wore expensive watches and carried phones that looked like they cost more than Marcus's car. One of them dropped a business card on the floor. Marcus picked it up and tried to give it back, but the man had already walked away. Marcus looked at the business card. The man was a partner at a big law firm downtown. The address was in the most expensive part of the city. Marcus put the card on the bench beside him in case the man came back looking for it. An older man in a security uniform walked over to Marcus. The security guard had gray hair and kind eyes. He looked at Marcus sitting on the bench with his old clothes and worn bag. "You okay, son?" the guard asked. "You look a little lost. You need help finding something?" Marcus looked up from his papers and smiled. "Thank you, sir. I'm just waiting for my case to be called. Courtroom 4B. The guard nodded. "That's Judge Whitmore's courtroom. Big cases happen in there. You sure you're in the right place?" "Yes, sir. I'm supposed to be here." The guard looked at Marcus's clothes again. "You got a lawyer helping you? There's legal aid across the street if you need help getting one." Marcus appreciated the guard's kindness. "I'm all set, but thank you for asking." The guard walked away, but Marcus could see him looking back with a worried expression. The guard probably thought Marcus was in some kind of trouble and couldn't afford a good lawyer. Marcus went back to reading his papers. He was used to people trying to help him because they thought he needed it. Most people saw his appearance and assumed he was poor and uneducated. They were half right. He was poor, at least compared to most people in this building, but he was definitely not uneducated. A young woman walked by carrying coffee for what looked like 3 or 4 lawyers. She was probably an assistant or intern. She wore a simple black dress and flat shoes. When she saw Marcus, she gave him a small smile. Maybe she understood what it was like to feel out of place in a building full of expensive suits. Marcus checked his watch. It was an old digital watch that his father had given him years ago. The plastic band was cracked, but it still kept perfect time. He had 30 minutes before he needed to be in the courtroom. That gave him time to review his notes one more time. He pulled out a small notebook from his bag. The notebook was filled with his handwriting. Every page contained important information about legal cases, court procedures, and constitutional law. Marcus had been writing in notebooks like this for years. He had dozens of them at home, all filled with knowledge he had gathered. As he read, Marcus felt confident about what he was here to do. His clothes might be old and his bag might be worn out, but his mind was sharp. His knowledge was deep. His preparation was complete. Soon, everyone in this building would see that appearances could be very deceiving. The morning sun continued to shine through the big windows. People continued to walk past him with their expensive clothes and important attitudes, but Marcus sat quietly on his bench, reading his papers and preparing for what was about to happen. He knew this day would be different from any other day in his life. In just a few hours, everything would change. Marcus sat quietly on the bench after the two judges walked away. Their laughter still echoed in his ears. He had faced this kind of treatment many times before, but it never got easier. People saw his old clothes and immediately decided they knew everything about him. He thought back to his childhood. Marcus had grown up in a small apartment with his grandmother after his parents died in a car accident. His grandmother worked 2 jobs to pay the rent. She cleaned offices at night and worked at a grocery store during the day. Money was always tight, but his grandmother believed in education more than anything else. She would sit with Marcus every night after her long day of work. Even when she was tired, she helped him with his homework. She checked his reading and made sure he understood his math problems. "Knowledge is the one thing nobody can take away from you," she used to tell him. "Rich or poor, smart is smart." Marcus had been a good student from the very beginning. While other kids played video games, he read books. While they watched TV, he studied. His teachers noticed how hard he worked. They gave him extra books to read and harder problems to solve. In high school, Marcus was the best student in his class. He won scholarship contests and academic competitions. His grandmother was so proud that she cried when he graduated as valedictorian. She had saved every newspaper article that mentioned his achievements. College was harder because of money, but Marcus found ways to make it work. He got scholarships, worked part-time jobs, and lived on very little. He studied law because he wanted to help people who were treated unfairly. People like him and his grandmother. Law school was even more difficult. Most of his classmates came from wealthy families. They had parents who were lawyers and judges. They wore expensive clothes and talked about vacation homes and private schools. Marcus felt out of place, but he worked harder than all of them. Now, sitting in this courthouse, Marcus remembered all those years of studying. All those nights when he stayed up reading cases while his classmates went to parties. All those times when he had to choose between buying food and buying textbooks. A young lawyer walked by carrying a stack of files. He was probably Marcus's age, but he looked very different. His suit was perfectly fitted and probably cost more than Marcus made in 6 months. His shoes were so shiny they reflected the ceiling lights. His briefcase had gold corners and his initials engraved on the side. The young lawyer glanced at Marcus, and then looked away quickly. Marcus could see the judgment in his eyes. Another person who thought he knew who Marcus was just by looking at him. Marcus opened his folder again and continued reading. The papers inside were more important than anyone in this building could imagine. They contained information about constitutional law that could affect thousands of people, but nobody would guess that by looking at the man holding them. A few minutes later, Judge Whitmore walked back through the lobby. He was heading toward his courtroom to prepare for the afternoon session. When he saw Marcus still sitting on the bench, he stopped and shook his head. "Still here, I see," the judge said with that same fake helpful tone. "You know, son, it's not too late to change your mind. Whatever you think you're going to accomplish in there, I can almost guarantee it won't go the way you hope." Marcus looked up from his papers. His expression was calm, but his eyes showed a strength that the judge hadn't noticed before. "Your Honor, I appreciate your concern," Marcus said politely. "But I'm exactly where I need to be." Judge Whitmore laughed again. "Confidence is good, young man, but overconfidence can be dangerous. The law is not something you can learn from watching TV shows or reading internet articles." "I understand that, sir." Do you? Do you really?" The judge's voice was getting more condescending. "Let me ask you something simple. Do you know the difference between a motion to dismiss and a motion for summary judgment?" Marcus could have explained both motions in detail. He could have discussed the legal standards, the timing requirements, and the procedural rules. He could have cited relevant cases and explained how different courts applied different standards. Instead, he just nodded. "I have some familiarity with legal motions," Marcus said quietly. Judge Whitmore rolled his eyes. "Some familiarity. That's rich." He looked around to see if anyone was listening to this conversation. "Tell me, what law school did you attend? Community college?" Marcus felt that spark of anger again, but he kept his voice steady. "I went to law school, Your Honor." "Which one?" Marcus paused for a moment. He could tell the truth and end this conversation right now. but something inside him wanted to see how far this judge would push his assumptions. "A school in Massachusetts," Marcus said. It wasn't a lie. Harvard Law School was definitely in Massachusetts. But Marcus knew the judge would assume he meant some small unknown school. "Massachusetts, huh?" Judge Whitmore smiled like he had proved his point. "Well, that explains a lot. Probably one of those online degree programs." Marcus didn't respond to that. He went back to reading his papers. This annoyed Judge Whitmore even more. "Look, son, I'm trying to help you here. Whatever case you think you have, it's probably not as strong as you believe. The legal system is complex. It takes years to understand how it really works." "I'm sure it does," Marcus replied without looking up. "You're sure?" The judge's voice was getting louder. "You sit there in your thrift store suit with your yard sale briefcase, and you're sure you understand the legal system?" A few people in the lobby turned to look at them. Marcus could feel their eyes on him. Some looked curious. Others looked embarrassed for him. A security guard started walking over to see if there was a problem. Marcus finally looked up at Judge Whitmore. His expression was still calm, but there was something different in his eyes now. Something that should have warned the judge to be more careful. "Your Honor," Marcus said quietly, "I understand that my appearance might give you certain impressions about who I am, but I can assure you that I belong in your courtroom today." Judge Whitmore was about to say something else when the security guard approached them. "Everything okay here, Judge?" the guard asked. "Oh, everything's fine," Judge Whitmore said with a wave of his hand. "Just trying to make sure this young man understands what he's getting himself into." The security guard looked at Marcus with concern. "You need any help, son?" "No, thank you," Marcus replied. "I'm all set." Judge Whitmore chuckled and started walking toward his courtroom. "Well, I'll see you in there shortly. Try not to embarrass yourself too badly." As the judge walked away, Marcus closed his folder and put it back in his worn bag. He stood up from the bench and straightened his too big suit jacket. Other people in the lobby continued to stare at him. Some whispered to each other about what they had just witnessed. Marcus didn't care what they thought. He had faced doubt and discrimination his whole life. Every time someone told him he wasn't good enough or smart enough, he had proved them wrong. Today would be no different. He walked slowly toward courtroom 4B. His old sneakers squeaked on the marble floor, but his steps were confident. Behind him, people continued to whisper and stare. They had no idea what they were about to witness. In a few minutes, Judge Richard Whitmore would learn that you should never judge a person by their appearance. He would learn that wisdom and knowledge could come in any package. And he would learn that sometimes the most important person in the room is the one nobody expects. Marcus walked into courtroom 4B and found a seat in the back row. The courtroom was beautiful with dark wood walls and high ceilings. Red carpet covered the floor, and the judge's bench sat high above everything else like a throne. Large windows let in afternoon sunlight that made everything glow. About 30 people sat in the wooden chairs. Most were lawyers in expensive suits. Some were court reporters with their special typing machines. A few were law students taking notes on everything they saw. Everyone looked important and busy. Marcus sat quietly in his chair and pulled out his folder again. He reviewed his papers one more time, checking every detail. This case was about constitutional law and federal procedures. It was the kind of case that could affect many people across the country. The bailiff stood up at the front of the room. He was a large man with a serious expression. "All rise," he called out in a loud voice. "The Honorable Judge Richard Whitmore, presiding." Everyone in the courtroom stood up as Judge Whitmore entered. He walked to his bench with confident steps, his black robes flowing behind him. When he sat down, everyone else sat down too. Judge Whitmore looked out at the people in his courtroom. His eyes stopped when he saw Marcus sitting in the back. The judge smiled slightly, remembering their conversation in the lobby. He was curious to see what this young man thought he was going to do. "Good afternoon, everyone," Judge Whitmore said. "We have several matters to address today. Let's begin with case number 2024 CV 891, Henderson versus the State Department. A lawyer in a gray suit stood up at one of the tables in front. "Your Honor, Attorney James Crawford representing the plaintiff." Another lawyer stood up at the other table. "Attorney Susan Blake representing the defendant." Judge Whitmore nodded and opened the file in front of him. "I understand we have several motions to address today. Let's start with the motion to dismiss." For the next hour, the lawyers argued back and forth about legal procedures and constitutional questions. They used big words and cited old court cases. They spoke with confidence about complex legal principles. Marcus listened carefully to everything they said. He took notes in a small notebook, writing down important points and legal citations. Sometimes he nodded when a lawyer made a good argument. Other times he frowned when someone made a mistake. Several people in the courtroom noticed Marcus taking such detailed notes. A law student sitting near him looked over curiously. She wondered why someone in such old clothes seemed to understand the legal arguments so well. Judge Whitmore also noticed Marcus's attention to the proceedings. The judge found it amusing that this young man was pretending to follow such complex legal discussions. He assumed Marcus was just trying to look smart. After an hour of arguments, Judge Whitmore was ready to make his ruling. But before he could speak, the bailiff approached his bench. "Your Honor," the bailiff said quietly, "I have a special motion that needs to be addressed." Judge Whitmore looked surprised. "A special motion? From whom?" The bailiff handed him a piece of paper. "Someone representing the office of the Supreme Court clerk." Judge Whitmore's eyebrows went up. The Supreme Court clerk's office only got involved in very important cases. Usually this meant the case might be appealed to the highest court in the country. "Very well," Judge Whitmore said. "Let's address this special motion." The bailiff walked to the center of the courtroom. "Special motion regarding constitutional procedure for case number 2024 CV 891, representing the office of the Supreme Court clerk." Everyone in the courtroom turned to see who would stand up. Lawyers looked around at each other, wondering which one of them had this important connection. The law student sat up straighter, excited to see a representative from the Supreme Court. Marcus Thompson stood up from his seat in the back row. A confused murmur went through the courtroom. People looked at each other with puzzled expressions. Several lawyers turned around to stare at Marcus. The law student next to where he had been sitting looked shocked. Marcus walked down the aisle toward the front of the courtroom. His old sneakers squeaked on the wooden floor with each step. His too big suit jacket moved awkwardly as he walked. His worn bag bounced against his side. Judge Whitmore's mouth fell open. He stared at Marcus in complete disbelief. This couldn't be right. The young man in old clothes who he had laughed at in the lobby couldn't possibly represent the Supreme Court clerk's office. "Excuse me," Judge Whitmore said, his voice shaky. "I think there's been some mistake." Marcus reached the front of the courtroom and stopped at the podium. He opened his worn bag and pulled out a folder filled with official documents. The papers had the seal of the United States Supreme Court at the top. "No mistake, Your Honor," Marcus said in a clear, professional voice. "I'm Marcus Thompson, Senior Clerk for Supreme Court Justice Elena Rodriguez. I'm here representing the Office of the Supreme Court Clerk in the matter of procedural review for case number 2024 CV 891. Marcus handed the official documents to the bailiff, who carried them to Judge Whitmore. The judge's hands were shaking slightly as he took the papers. The entire courtroom was silent. Everyone stared at Marcus in amazement. The expensive lawyers who had ignored him now looked at him with respect and curiosity. The law students frantically wrote notes about what they were witnessing. Judge Whitmore read the documents carefully. His face grew pale as he saw Marcus's credentials. The papers showed that Marcus had graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Law School. They showed that he had been personally selected by Justice Rodriguez for one of the most prestigious positions in the American legal system. The documents also explained why Marcus was there. The Supreme Court was considering whether to review this case on appeal. Marcus had been sent to observe the proceedings and report back to Justice Rodriguez about any procedural issues that might affect the case. Judge Whitmore looked up from the papers and stared at Marcus. The young man in the thrift store suit was one of the most important legal minds in the country. He worked directly with Supreme Court justices on constitutional law and federal procedures. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Whitmore said, his voice barely above a whisper. I had no idea." Marcus nodded politely. "No reason you should have, Your Honor. May I proceed with the special motion?" Judge Whitmore was still in shock, but he managed to nod. "Yes, of course, please proceed." Marcus opened his folder and pulled out several pages of typed notes. His handwriting filled the margins with additional observations and legal citations. "Your Honor," Marcus began, "the Supreme Court has identified several procedural questions in this case that may warrant appellate review. Specifically, there are concerns about the application of the Due Process Clause in relation to federal agency actions." As Marcus spoke, his voice was confident and professional. He cited legal cases from memory and explained complex constitutional principles with ease. Every word showed years of intensive legal education and experience at the highest levels of the court system. The lawyers at the front tables listened in amazement. This young man knew more about constitutional law than most of them had learned in their entire careers. His analysis was brilliant and his understanding was deep. Judge Whitmore sat in stunned silence, listening to every word. Less than 2 hours ago, he had laughed at this man. He had assumed Marcus was poor and uneducated. He had suggested that Marcus didn't belong in his courtroom. Now Judge Whitmore realized he was listening to one of the most qualified legal experts in the entire country. Marcus Thompson had access to Supreme Court justices and helped shape constitutional law for the entire nation. The judge felt sick to his stomach as he remembered his cruel comments in the lobby. He had judged Marcus based only on his appearance and had been completely wrong about everything. Judge Whitmore felt the blood drain from his face as he continued reading Marcus's credentials. Each line made his stomach sink deeper. Harvard Law School, summa cum laude, Law Review Editor, Supreme Court Clerkship with Justice Rodriguez. Publications, in Constitutional Law Journals. Awards for Legal Scholarship. This wasn't just any lawyer standing in front of him. This was one of the brightest legal minds in the entire country. Marcus Thompson had access to the highest court in America. He worked directly with Supreme Court justices on cases that affected millions of people. The judge's mind raced back to their conversation in the lobby just 2 hours earlier. He remembered his condescending tone, his fake helpful smile, his assumptions about Marcus's education and abilities. Every word he had spoken now seemed cruel and ignorant. "Son, if you're here for legal aid, that office is across the street." The judge's own words echoed in his memory like a terrible nightmare. He had said that to one of the most respected legal scholars in the country. Judge Whitmore looked around his courtroom. Every person was staring at Marcus with respect and amazement. The expensive lawyers who had ignored him in the lobby now hung on his every word. The law students scribbled notes frantically, knowing they were witnessing something extraordinary. Attorney James Crawford, the plaintiff's lawyer, couldn't hide his shock. He had walked past Marcus in the lobby earlier and dismissed him as someone who probably couldn't afford a decent lawyer. Now he realized he had ignored someone whose legal knowledge far exceeded his own. Attorney Susan Blake looked equally stunned. She had 30 years of experience in federal court, but she had never worked with anyone from the Supreme Court clerk's office. She understood the tremendous honor and responsibility that came with such a position. Marcus continued his presentation with calm professionalism. He explained the constitutional issues in detail, citing cases that most lawyers had never heard of. His analysis was brilliant and thorough. Every point he made showed deep understanding of federal law and Supreme Court procedure. The due process concerns in this case relate specifically to the Administrative Procedure Act, Marcus explained. In the recent case of Williams versus Department of Education, the Supreme Court established new standards for agency review that directly apply to the facts before this court. Judge Whitmore had never heard of Williams versus Department of Education. He realized it must be a very recent Supreme Court decision that hadn't made it into the legal databases yet. Marcus had access to information that regular lawyers wouldn't see for weeks or months. The judge tried to focus on Marcus's legal arguments, but his mind kept returning to their earlier encounter. He remembered Judge Patricia Mills laughing along with his cruel comments. They had both been so certain they knew who Marcus was based on his appearance. Marcus pulled out another document from his folder. Justice Rodriguez has asked me to observe this proceeding specifically because of its potential impact on federal agency authority. The Supreme Court is considering whether to grant certiorari for cases involving similar constitutional questions. Certiorari was the legal term for when the Supreme Court agreed to review a lower court's decision. If the Supreme Court decided to review this case, it would become one of the most important legal decisions of the year. Judge Whitmore's hands were shaking as he held Marcus's credentials. He realized that his ruling in this case might be reviewed by the highest court in America. Everything he said and did would be scrutinized by Supreme Court justices. But more than that, he realized how badly he had misjudged Marcus Thompson. The young man standing before him had overcome poverty and discrimination to reach the highest levels of the legal profession. His worn clothes and old bag told a story of struggle and sacrifice, not ignorance or incompetence. Marcus had probably worked twice as hard as his wealthy classmates to get where he was. While other students had family money to support them, Marcus had likely worked multiple jobs to pay for law school. While others networked at expensive restaurants, Marcus had spent his time in libraries studying constitutional law. The judge thought about his own privileged background. He had grown up in a wealthy family where legal careers were common. His father had been a lawyer, and his grandfather had been a judge. Judge Whitmore had attended private schools and expensive law school without worrying about money. He had never faced the kind of discrimination that Marcus probably encountered every day. People had always treated Judge Whitmore with respect because of his family name and expensive clothes. He had never been judged harshly based on his appearance. Your Honor, Marcus continued, Justice Rodriguez has specifically requested that I observe how this court handles the procedural motions in this case. The Supreme Court is developing new guidelines for federal agency review, and this case may serve as an important precedent. Judge Whitmore nodded weakly. He understood that every decision he made today would be reported directly to a Supreme Court justice. His ruling would be analyzed by some of the most brilliant legal minds in the country. A few rows behind Marcus, a young law student raised her hand tentatively. Judge Whitmore nodded for her to speak. Excuse me, Mr. Thompson, she said nervously. I'm a student at the local law school. Would it be appropriate to ask about your experience working with the Supreme Court? Marcus turned and smiled kindly at the student. Of course. The Supreme Court is always interested in supporting legal education. What would you like to know? The student's question opened a brief discussion about Supreme Court procedures and constitutional law. Marcus answered every question with patience and detailed knowledge. He encouraged the students to pursue constitutional law and explained the importance of protecting individual rights. Judge Whitmore listened to this exchange. With growing admiration and shame, Marcus was not only brilliant but also kind and generous with his knowledge. Despite facing discrimination and assumptions about his background, he remained professional and helpful to others. The judge remembered his grandmother who had taught him that true character was shown by how people treated those who couldn't help them. Marcus had every right to be angry about how he had been treated, but instead he remained gracious and focused on his work. As Marcus finished answering the students' questions, Judge Whitmore realized something important. The young man's worn clothes and old bag weren't signs of failure or ignorance. They were signs of sacrifice and dedication. Marcus had chosen to pursue justice and constitutional law instead of high-paying corporate work. Many Supreme Court clerks could earn enormous salaries at big law firms after their clerkships ended. But Marcus had chosen to continue his public service, working to protect constitutional rights and improve the legal system. His modest appearance reflected his commitment to justice over personal wealth. Judge Whitmore felt a deep sense of shame wash over him. He had judged Marcus based on superficial appearances and had been completely wrong. Worse than that, he had been cruel and condescending to someone who deserved respect and admiration. The judge realized that this moment would change him forever. He could never again assume he knew someone based on their clothes or their background. He had learned a painful but important lesson about prejudice and assumptions. Marcus gathered his papers and prepared to conclude his presentation. Your Honor, the Supreme Court will be very interested in your ruling on these procedural motions. Justice Rodriguez trusts that this court will carefully consider the constitutional implications of its decisions. Judge Whitmore nodded solemnly. He understood that this case had become much more significant than he had originally thought. But more importantly, he understood that he had just met one of the most impressive people he had ever encountered. The young man in the thrift store suit had just taught him the most important lesson of his judicial career. Marcus returned to his seat in the back of the courtroom, but everything had changed. The whispers and stares that followed him now were filled with respect rather than judgment. The law students turned around to get better looks at him. The expensive lawyers craned their necks to see the young man who worked directly with Supreme Court justices. Judge Whitmore tried to regain his composure and continue with the case, but his hands were still shaking slightly as he shuffled through his papers. He'd been a judge for 15 years, but he had never felt so uncertain about his own abilities. Let's continue with the hearing, Judge Whitmore said, his voice not quite as confident as before. Attorney Crawford, you may proceed with your arguments on the motion for summary judgment. Attorney Crawford stood up, but he kept glancing back at Marcus. The lawyer had prepared his arguments carefully, but now he worried about making mistakes in front of someone from the Supreme Court clerk's office. As Crawford began his presentation, Marcus pulled out his notebook and started taking detailed notes. He wrote down key legal arguments, procedural issues, and constitutional questions. His pen moved quickly across the page, capturing every important detail. Judge Whitmore found himself watching Marcus more than the lawyer who was speaking. Every time Marcus nodded, the judge felt relieved. When Marcus frowned or wrote something urgently, the judge worried that a mistake was being made. Your Honor, Crawford said, the plaintiff argues that the federal agency exceeded its constitutional authority by implementing regulations without proper public comment periods. Marcus looked up from his notes and made eye contact with Judge Whitmore. The judge could see intelligence and analysis in Marcus's expression. It was clear that Marcus was evaluating every aspect of the legal arguments. Crawford continued his presentation for 20 minutes, citing various cases and constitutional principles. When he finished, Judge Whitmore called on Attorney Blake to present the government's response. Blake stood up nervously. She had noticed how carefully Marcus was taking notes, and she understood the significance of having a Supreme Court observer in the courtroom. Your Honor, Blake began, the government maintains that all proper procedures were followed according to the Administrative Procedure Act. As Blake spoke, Marcus raised his hand slightly. Judge Whitmore immediately recognized him. Mr. Thompson, do you have a question? Marcus stood up respectfully. Your Honor, I want to clarify a procedural point that may be relevant to the Supreme Court's review. Attorney Blake mentioned the Administrative Procedure Act, but I believe the recent Supreme Court decision in Chen v. Department of Commerce may have changed the application of those procedures. Blake looked confused. I'm not familiar with Chen v. Department of Commerce. It was decided just 3 weeks ago, Marcus explained politely. The Supreme Court ruled that federal agencies must provide enhanced public notice for regulations that affect constitutional rights. This decision may directly impact the case before this court. Judge Whitmore had never heard of this case either. He realized that Marcus had access to Supreme Court decisions before they were widely published. This was information that could completely change the legal analysis. Mr. Thompson, Judge Whitmore said carefully, could you explain how this recent decision might affect our proceedings? Marcus opened his folder and pulled out a copy of the Supreme Court decision. Certainly, Your Honor. In Chen v. Department of Commerce, the Supreme Court held that when federal agencies create regulations affecting fundamental constitutional rights, they must provide extended public comment periods and enhanced notice procedures. He handed copies of the decision to both attorneys and to Judge Whitmore. The papers had the official Supreme Court seal and were clearly authentic documents. The facts in Chen are very similar to the facts in this case, Marcus continued. The agency implemented regulations affecting due process rights without following The enhanced procedures required by the Supreme Court's new ruling. Attorney Blake read through the decision quickly, her face growing pale. This new Supreme Court ruling completely undermined her legal arguments. The government's position was no longer legally sound. Attorney Crawford looked excited as he read the decision. This Supreme Court ruling strongly supported his client's case, but he was also embarrassed that he hadn't known about such an important decision. Judge Whitmore studied the Supreme Court decision carefully. The legal analysis was complex, but Marcus had explained it clearly. This new ruling would require him to reconsider many aspects of the case. Mr. Thompson, the judge said, this is obviously a very recent and significant decision. How should the court proceed given this new legal precedent? Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. Your Honor, Justice Rodriguez has asked me to observe how lower courts apply recent Supreme Court decisions to similar cases. The court is very interested in ensuring consistent application of constitutional principles. The message was clear. The Supreme Court would be watching to see if Judge Whitmore correctly applied the new legal precedent. His decision would be scrutinized by the highest court in the country. I understand, Judge Whitmore said. He turned to the attorneys. I think we need to take a recess to allow both sides to review this new Supreme Court decision and revise their arguments accordingly. During the recess, several people approached Marcus. The law students asked him questions about Supreme Court procedures and constitutional law. The attorneys wanted to discuss the implications of the Chen decision. Marcus answered every question, with patience and detailed knowledge. He explained complex legal concepts in simple terms that everyone could understand. His teaching ability was as impressive as his legal expertise. One of the law students asked, Mr. Thompson, how did you get selected for such a prestigious position? Marcus smiled. Hard work, dedication, and a lot of help from professors who believed in me. The Supreme Court looks for clerks who understand that the law exists to protect people's rights and ensure justice. Judge Whitmore overheard this conversation from his chambers. He realized that Marcus's success came from the same qualities he had dismissed in the lobby: determination, intelligence, and commitment to justice. When the hearing resumed, both attorneys presented revised arguments based on the new Supreme Court decision. Marcus continued taking detailed notes, occasionally nodding or making annotations. Attorney Blake had to concede that the government's position was weakened by the Chen decision. Your Honor, in light of the Supreme Court's recent ruling, the government acknowledges that additional procedural steps may have been required. Attorney Crawford argued that the Chen decision clearly supported his client's case. The Supreme Court has established that the exact procedures that were missing, in this case, are constitutionally required. Throughout these revised arguments, Judge Whitmore found himself looking to Marcus for guidance. When Marcus nodded approvingly, the judge felt more confident. When Marcus took urgent notes, the judge paid closer attention to potential problems. After both attorneys finished their presentations, Judge Whitmore addressed Marcus directly. Mr. Thompson, do you have any additional observations that might be helpful to the court? Marcus stood up and spoke thoughtfully. Your Honor, this case presents an excellent opportunity to demonstrate how lower courts can properly apply new Supreme Court precedents. Justice Rodriguez believes that consistent application of constitutional principles across all courts is essential for maintaining the rule of law. The message was both encouraging and warning. If Judge Whitmore applied the law correctly, the Supreme Court would view his decision favorably. If he made mistakes, his ruling might be overturned on appeal. Thank you, Mr. Thompson, Judge Whitmore said. Your observations have been extremely valuable to this court. As the hearing concluded, Judge Whitmore realized that Marcus had not only provided crucial legal information but had also demonstrated the highest levels of professionalism and expertise. Despite facing discrimination and assumptions, Marcus had remained focused on his important work. The young man in the thrift store suit had just shown everyone in the courtroom what true legal excellence looked like. The hearing ended at 4:30 in the afternoon. Judge Whitmore announced that he would issue his ruling within 1 week after carefully reviewing all the legal precedents, especially the recent Supreme Court decision that Marcus had brought to his attention. As people began filing out of the courtroom, Judge Whitmore remained at his bench pretending to organize his papers. He was actually watching Marcus gather his documents and put them back into his worn leather bag. The judge felt a heavy weight in his chest that had been growing all afternoon. Marcus closed his folder carefully and stood up from his seat. Several law students approached him with more questions about constitutional law and Supreme Court procedures. He answered each question patiently, offering encouragement about their legal studies. The most important thing to remember, Marcus told the students, is that the law exists to protect people's rights and ensure fairness. Never forget that every case affects real people's lives. Judge Whitmore listened to these words and felt even worse about his earlier behavior. Marcus wasn't just brilliant, he was also kind and dedicated to justice. The judge had misjudged not only Marcus's abilities but also his character. As the students left, Marcus began walking toward the courtroom exit. Judge Whitmore knew this was his chance to speak privately with Marcus. He quickly stepped down from his bench and called out, "Mr. Thompson, could I have a word with you?" Marcus stopped and turned around. "Of course, Your Honor." Judge Whitmore gestured toward the hallway outside the courtroom. "Perhaps we could speak privately." They walked out into the marble hallway where their first conversation had taken place just a few hours earlier. The afternoon sun still streamed through the tall windows, but everything felt different now. Judge Whitmore took a deep breath and looked directly at Marcus. His face showed genuine remorse and embarrassment. "Mr. Thompson," the judge began, his voice much quieter than usual, "I owe you a sincere apology for my behavior earlier today. My comments in the lobby were completely inappropriate and unprofessional." Marcus listened without interrupting, his expression calm and attentive. "I made assumptions about you based solely on your appearance," Judge Whitmore continued. "I was wrong about everything: your education, your abilities, your purpose in my courtroom. I'm deeply ashamed of how I treated you." The judge paused, struggling to find the right words. "I've been a judge for 15 years and I thought I was fair and unbiased. Today you showed me that I still have prejudices I didn't even recognize." Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "I appreciate your apology, Your Honor. I understand that first impressions can be misleading." "But that's no excuse," Judge Whitmore said firmly. "I should never have spoken to you the way I did, regardless of who I thought you were. Every person deserves respect and courtesy, especially in a courthouse where justice is supposed to be blind." The judge looked down at his expensive shoes, then back up at Marcus. "I keep thinking about what you must have gone through to get where you are, the obstacles you've overcome, the discrimination you've probably faced. And then I became part of that problem." Marcus was quiet for a moment before responding. "Your Honor, I have faced assumptions and prejudice many times in my life. But I've learned that getting angry or bitter doesn't help anyone. The best response is to let my work speak for itself." "But how do you stay so gracious about it?" Judge Whitmore asked. "I would be furious if someone treated me the way I treated you." Marcus smiled slightly. "My grandmother taught me something important when I was young. She said that other people's behavior says more about them than it does about you. When someone judges you unfairly, it reveals their character, not yours." Judge Whitmore felt the wisdom in those words. "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Marcus said. "She worked 2 jobs to raise me after my parents died. She never had much money, but she always treated everyone with dignity and respect. She taught me that a person's worth isn't measured by their wealth or their clothes." The judge thought about his own privileged upbringing and felt even more ashamed. "I grew up with every advantage possible. I never had to worry about money or face discrimination. I should have been more aware of my own biases." "We all have unconscious biases, Your Honor," Marcus said gently. "The important thing is recognizing them and working to overcome them. Today's experience can make you a better judge if you learn from it." Judge Whitmore was struck by Marcus's generosity and maturity. Even after being treated badly, Marcus was offering guidance and forgiveness. "You know," the judge said, "I've been wondering about something all afternoon. You could have told me who you were right away in the lobby. You could have ended my ignorant comments immediately. Why didn't you?" Marcus considered the question carefully. I suppose I was curious to see how far your assumptions would go, and maybe I hoped it would be a learning experience for both of us. It certainly has been, Judge Whitmore admitted. I'll never forget this lesson. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching other people walk through the courthouse lobby. Lawyers and clerks hurried past them, everyone focused on their own important business. Mr. Thompson, Judge Whitmore said, can I ask you something else? How do you handle the pressure of working at such a high level while facing people's prejudices about your background? Marcus thought about the question. I remember why I chose this career. I wanted to help protect people's constitutional rights and ensure that justice is available to everyone, regardless of their wealth or status. When I focus on that mission, other people's opinions matter less. That's a noble calling, Judge Whitmore said with genuine respect. Every judge and lawyer should see it that way, Marcus replied. The law is supposed to be the great equalizer in our society. It should protect the poor as well as the rich, the powerless as well as the powerful. Judge Whitmore nodded, understanding that he had received an important reminder about the true purpose of his role as a judge. Mr. Thompson, I want you to know that this conversation has changed me, the judge said earnestly. I'm going to work harder to examine my own biases and treat every person in my courtroom with equal respect. That's all anyone can ask for, Marcus replied. We all have room to grow and improve. As they prepared to part ways, Judge Whitmore extended his hand to Marcus. Thank you for your patience and your wisdom today. You've made me a better judge and a better person. Marcus shook the judge's hand firmly. Thank you for being open to learning, Your Honor. That takes courage and humility. Judge Whitmore watched as Marcus walked away, his old sneakers squeaking on the marble floor. But now the judge saw something completely different. He saw a brilliant legal mind, a dedicated public servant, and a person of remarkable character and grace. The young man in the thrift store suit had just taught him the most important lesson of his career. 3 weeks after the hearing, Judge Whitmore sat in his office early in the morning, reading through case files for the day ahead. His coffee had grown cold as he worked, but he barely noticed. He was thinking about Marcus Thompson and the lesson he had learned that afternoon. The judge had issued his ruling in the Henderson case exactly 1 week after the hearing, as promised. Following Marcus's guidance about the Supreme Court's decision in Chen versus Department of Commerce, Judge Whitmore had ruled in favor of the plaintiff. The federal agency had indeed failed to follow proper constitutional procedures. 2 days after his ruling, Judge Whitmore received a letter on official Supreme Court letterhead. It was from Justice Elena Rodriguez, thanking him for his careful application of recent Supreme Court precedent. The letter mentioned that Marcus Thompson had reported favorably on the court's handling of constitutional issues. Judge Whitmore had framed that letter and hung it in his office, but not because of the praise. He kept it as a reminder of how wrong he could be about people and how important it was to remain humble. Since that day, Judge Whitmore had made significant changes to his courtroom procedures. He now made sure to greet every person who entered his courtroom with the same level of respect, regardless of their appearance or apparent wealth. He had instructed his bailiff and court staff to treat all visitors with courtesy and dignity. The judge had also started a new practice. Before each session, he reminded himself that he didn't know the full story of any person who appeared before him. Someone who looked poor might be struggling to pay for their children's medical bills. Someone in old clothes might be sacrificing their own comfort to help family members. Someone who seemed nervous might be facing their first encounter with the legal system. Judge Patricia Mills, his colleague who had laughed along with his cruel comments that day, had also changed her behavior. Judge Whitmore had told her privately about Marcus's true identity and their conversation afterward. Judge Mills had been shocked and embarrassed by her own prejudiced assumptions. Together, the two judges had implemented new training programs for court staff about treating all visitors with respect. They had also started mentoring young lawyers and law students, especially those from disadvantaged backgrounds who might face discrimination in the legal profession. Word of the incident had spread quietly through the legal community, though Marcus had never complained or spoken negatively about Judge Whitmore. Instead, the story was told as an example of how easy it was to misjudge people and how important it was to look beyond surface appearances. Several law schools had invited Marcus to speak about his experiences in the legal profession. He always focused on the positive aspects of his career and encouraged students to pursue justice regardless of their backgrounds. He never mentioned specific incidents of discrimination, but his message was clear. Hard work and dedication could overcome prejudice. Marcus continued his distinguished career at the Supreme Court, working on cases that affected constitutional rights across the country. Justice Rodriguez had praised his analytical skills and his commitment to justice. Several other Supreme Court justices had requested his assistance on important constitutional questions. Despite his success, Marcus remained humble and approachable. He still wore modest clothes and carried his old leather bag, not because he couldn't afford better things, but because he had learned that true worth came from character and actions, not from expensive possessions. The law students who had met Marcus that day in court never forgot his kindness and wisdom. Several of them had stayed in touch with him, seeking advice about their careers and constitutional law questions. Marcus always made time to help young lawyers understand the importance of using the law to protect people's rights. One student, Sarah Martinez, had been particularly inspired by Marcus's example. She came from a poor family and had worried about fitting into the legal profession. After meeting Marcus, she realized that her background could be a strength rather than a weakness. She understood the struggles of ordinary people and could help bridge the gap between the law and the communities it served. 6 months after the hearing, Sarah was working as a clerk for Judge Whitmore. The judge had specifically sought out law students from diverse backgrounds wanting to learn from their perspectives and experiences. Sarah brought a fresh viewpoint to his chambers and helped him understand legal issues from different angles. Judge Whitmore often thought about how much richer his courtroom had become since he started truly listening to people from all backgrounds. His legal decisions were more thoughtful and his understanding of justice was deeper. The security guard who had tried to help Marcus that first day had also learned from the experience. He had witnessed the entire transformation and understood the importance of treating every person with dignity. He began greeting all courthouse visitors warmly and offering assistance without making assumptions about their purposes or backgrounds. Marcus's impact extended beyond just one courthouse. The story of his encounter with Judge Whitmore had become a teaching tool in law schools and judicial training programs. It was used to help future lawyers and judges understand the dangers of unconscious bias and the importance of remaining open-minded. The legal profession, like many others, had a long history of excluding people based on their backgrounds, race, or economic status. Marcus's success and grace in the face of discrimination had become an inspiration for others who faced similar challenges. Years later, Judge Whitmore would still tell people that meeting Marcus Thompson was the most important moment of his judicial career, not because of Marcus's impressive credentials or his connection to the Supreme Court, but because of the lesson he had taught about human dignity and the danger of judging others. Marcus had shown that wisdom, intelligence, and character could come in any package. He had proven that a person's worth was not determined by their wealth, their clothes, or their background, but by their actions and their commitment to justice. The young man in the thrift store suit had changed more than just one courtroom that day. He had started a ripple effect that continued to spread, making the legal system more fair and more respectful for everyone who sought justice. In the end, Marcus Thompson's greatest achievement was not his brilliant legal mind or his prestigious position. It was his ability to remain dignified and gracious in the face of prejudice, and to use his experiences to help create a more just and equitable world for others. The lesson he taught that day in the courthouse would continue to influence lawyers, judges, and law students for generations to come. Sometimes the most powerful changes begin with a single person who refuses to let other people's assumptions define them, and who chooses to respond to prejudice with grace and wisdom rather than anger and bitterness. Marcus Thompson had shown everyone what true legal excellence looked like, and the legal profession was better because of it.